Hi, my name is Nia Morton and I'm presenting part of my thesis today. It is entitled The Power of Naming as Coloniality, Shaping Our Ontologies and Epistemologies. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land we are gathered upon belongs to the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshu, Ute, and Navajo peoples. I acknowledge that indigenous peoples endure ongoing genocide, oppression, and repression. Nonetheless, indigenous ways of living and knowing persist today, and they ought to be centered and celebrated. While it can be liberatory to choose our name or category to define ourselves, it's not always so simple. Names carry socially constructed assumptions, meanings, histories, and symbols, such that when a mind-body is named, sometimes they're unable to escape these things. For instance, medical diagnosis can lead to and justify institutionalization, sterilization, torture, and abuse. The great authors that inspired and guided this paper are Maria Lugones and Annabel Quijano. Specifically, Lugones critiques and broadens Quijano's framing of the coloniality of power. In essence, it becomes, through her reworking, the global implementation of naturalized biological social identities and names that naturalize relations of inferiority and superiority. Nonetheless, neither Lugones nor Quijano unpack coloniality's deep power to name and the power of names themselves. Conversely, while identity politics today investigate names and the speech act of naming, they ignore their deep colonial history. Thus, I am interested in that power of acts of naming that manifest today, but can only be understood with learning its colonial histories. Thus, some of my research questions are, what does the colonial history of the act of naming reveal about social identities and names? Why does this history matter? And what do we lose? What are the costs of overlooking this colonial history? In this paper, I argued that the act of naming as coloniality arose in a specific context, colonialism, for specific reasons, to embolden European colonial domination by naturalizing colonial relations, and with differential effects for specific body minds, by marking mind bodies with layers that ascribe specific social privileges and political rights, and deprive of others. I argue that names themselves and acts of naming exercise immense power that cannot be understood apart from its colonial roots without great losses. Thus, to dive into my thesis, we must first understand coloniality. So, Quijano denotes Eurocentric colonialism as a formal system of direct social, political, and cultural domination of other societies by Western European ones. While Eurocentric colonialism has been defeated in the majority of cases today for Quijano, the coloniality of power which formed originally in the matrix of colonialism constitutes the basic framework of power today. The setting is that with the global expansion of colonialism, a new body of knowledge was needed that would naturalize colonial relations and situate colonized mind bodies in naturalized positions of inferiority. Coloniality does just that. It naturalizes these colonial relations by elaborating the ideas of social identities according to supposedly differential biological structures. Coloniality's names indicated the natural and biological differences amongst humans, and its acts of naming situated colonized people in a naturalized position of inferiority according to their biological traits. The layers that this naming scars into the world's body minds naturalizes various levels of hierarchical relations, creating a complex web of relations where a body mind's marquees signify their various rights, privileges, positions in relativity to other people. Thus, coloniality as naming denotes a corpus of knowledge and the literal act of naming. Both Lugones and Quijano illuminate that coloniality changed the ways in which relations of inferiority and superiority were to be established. However, they don't attribute this key transformation to its power to name and the power of names themselves. Coloniality, in its acts of namings and the creation of colonial names, fundamentally changed the way in which hierarchical relations are established today by replacing the relations of superiority and inferiority previously established through domination, and by reconceiving of humanity and human relations fictionally, in biological, scientific, rational terms. Thus, hierarchical social relations no longer need to be established through literal, material, and physical domination. Coloniality names us in ways that frames these relations as biological givens, natural facts, and inherent aspects of our existence. Coloniality as naming therefore camouflages and conceals how these relations are inherently violent, exploitative, and unjust, and that they are products of mythical constructions of names. As we can see, coloniality's naming fundamentally altered who we are as ourselves and who we are in relations to others. And it drastically changed how we understand ourselves, each other, and our social relations. Thus, relations of superiority and inferiority have, for the past 500 years, remained to be established through the act of naming itself. Another aspect of the colonial roots of naming lies in the imposition of these names onto colonized mind bodies, in a literal sense. The imposition of these biological constructs onto indigenous communities played an insidious role in their colonization, and it affects all domains of their existences. In short, colonizers' imposition of social identities fosters gendered, heterosexual, patriarchal, ableist, classist, and racist organizations of life that deprive and suppress, to varying degrees of success, colonized peoples of many aspects of their livelihoods. Oyoronki Oyuwumi clarifies that patriarchy is not a transcultural category, existing in multiple pre-colonial cultures around the globe. She argues that gender was not an organizing principle in Yoruba society prior to colonization by the West. While gender did not function to organize pre-colonial Yoruba society, Europe's authority in translating and interpreting the world imposes its own rationalities and cultural patterns to understand other cultures, mind bodies, and histories. Thus, the power of names literally distort our understandings of languages, cultures, history, and communities. But this isn't to take away from the fact that it's colonial and white Western individuals who exercise the power to name. The force of names, nonetheless, disseminates history books and our imaginations. We struggle to imagine a society devoid of dualistic, name-based relations and names themselves, because indigenous ways of knowing and being with each other that are not constrained by binarily opposed, hierarchical names have been continually manipulated to bolster the Western narrative that names are natural, necessary descriptors of human differences. Further, Oyuwumi discloses that the emergence of women as an identifiable category was one of the first accomplishments of the colonial state. For in pre-colonial Yoruba society, state organizations, power, political roles, and leadership were not gender-determined, had nothing to do with gender. This alien introduction of this colonial category and names not only unacknowledged but dispossessed Yoruba females of their political roles. She explained that the exclusion of women from the newly constructed colonial public sphere furthered the transformation of state power to male gender power precisely because females were categorized and reduced to women, and thereby marked ineligible for leadership or political roles. Thus, the introduction of names and coloniality's acts of naming Yoruba females woman stripped them of their powerful leadership roles because the reduction to women marks them as ineligible, disqualified from the entire public sphere. She illuminates the economic, political, and cognitive inferiorization, as well as the inferiorization of Yoruba females in terms of both race and gender. She allows us to see the scope of naming, their deep reduction to women, to the private sphere, to unpolitical and irrational mind bodies incapable of engaging in politics and economics. The possible ways of living and knowing beyond hegemonic Western reality shaped by names today, is nearly impossible without learning about pre-colonial and current indigenous societies, knowledges, spiritualities, and practices. While this paper is limited to evaluating only pre-colonial indigenous societies and ways of living and being, these ways of living and knowing are not extinct. For indigenous peoples, these deprivations of rights and privileges cut extremely deep. The reduction to words with specific, dehumanizing connotations, roles, rights, and freedoms, their subjection to colonial knowledges, culture, and organizations of life, all set in motion by colonialism, all made possible by naming. Thus, the colonial roots of naming within and as coloniality reveals that names, social identities, and acts of namings are never purely descriptive, natural, neutral. Relations of superiority and inferiority are now established through acts of naming, which means that they shape our behaviors, expressions, and our imaginations in ways that reinforce relations of domination and exploitation. Names and their deep effects on our imaginations, knowledges, and lives today conceal that other ways of living and structuring life, other ways of knowing and being in the world, have been and are possible. When we ignore the colonial roots of naming, we miss how, at their most fundamental level, names serve as weapons that naturalize unjust and oppressive relations. We overlook how names robbed indigenous peoples and women, specifically, of nearly every aspect of life to varying degrees of success. When we ignore the colonial roots of names, we fail to understand that names cannot be separated from these histories, and that names scar our bodies with a host of signs, symbols, images, meanings, and describe roles and possible ways of being and knowing. However, socialized organizations do not have to be structured and based on names, classifications, nor identities. Gender-based oppression, sexual dimorphism, and sexuality-based oppression, and all of the other forms of oppression and genocide, all would not be conceivable as organizations of social relations and life today without the names that denote these identities and set up these naturalized relations of inferiority and superiority. These are all of the wonderful works by Maria Lugones and Annabel Quijano that I used mainly for this presentation and for my paper. I wasn't the best at citing things in this presentation, so if you have any questions or clarifications, you can email me. Things that I mainly would want folks to take away is that the power of names and the acts of naming themselves have to be understood as compulsory, wrapped up in power and privilege and relations of oppression and exploitation and domination, and that they're best understood in their manifestations today through analyzing their colonial roots. And that sometimes we cannot escape the fact that names and identities arose as weapons and to justify horrible things and to further obscene violence, and they still do today. Priority. Thus, today I've tried to show you the deep colonial history of names. There's so much to unpack here, and it was really difficult to make a 15-minute presentation, but I hope that what you take away from this presentation is that names come with histories, and they have differential effects for people. And while we can choose them, and there's a more fluid environment and culture in general for us to have some freedom with these things, for some people it's just not so. And they concretely can shape what we can know and who we can be in distinctly violent ways. Thank you.